Hello, folks, and welcome back to another compilation of strange and spooky wilderness stories sent to me by our listeners. Now, there's been a whole lot of submissions that I just haven't had the time or opportunity to go through, but hang tight, and I'll get to them eventually. But in the meantime, I thought I'd share a few more recent experiences sent to me by the listeners that I thought were pretty thought-provoking and bizarre. So here you go. Story 1. Last July, I found myself in a bit of a weird situation while hiking along the beaches of Pompano Beach State Park in Maine. Just off the coast from the beach is a tiny island called Fox Island. During low tide, visitors can actually walk out to it, which is about a quarter-mile in distance from the beach. Well, that afternoon, that's just what I did. There were others, too. I was with the last group of visitors, and by the time we left Fox Island around 6 p.m., the tide began to make its way back. And once that tide comes in, well, it's inaccessible for several hours or so. I made it back to the beach in time, just as the water level made its way up to our knees. And as I bent down to reach for my towel, I heard shouting from the couple next to me. "There's still someone out there," one of them yelled. I remembered glancing back at the island, and sure enough, there was someone standing at the highest point of it. I wasn't able to discern whether it was male or female, but one thing was clear. That someone was stranded, and there was no way in hell they'd make it back to shore with that current, even if they followed the tiny sliver of land that connected the 2 points. But the longer we looked at this individual, the stranger things seemed to be. Well, that person wasn't exactly behaving in a way a trapped person probably would have in that scenario. We expected them to at least yell or wave their arms like a lunatic, but there was none of that at all. They just stood there like a tree. Now, I hadn't seen anyone else on that island when we left, and I was pretty sure I was one of the last people, if not the last one to leave. Was this individual taking a nap or something when we all left? Well, according to the title chart on magicseaweed.com, it would be another 6 hours or so before low tide would kick in. I know 6 hours doesn't seem like a long time, but if that person didn't have water, they'd be SOL, and it must have been around 85 degrees that afternoon. Well, at this point, several other onlookers had gathered around the shoreline, trying to figure out why that person was still out there during high tide. By the time I got through to emergency services, they had already been notified of the situation. The first to arrive 10 minutes later were 2 Pompano Beach State Park employees, followed by a patrol boat that rounded the corner and began to head out to the island. But something really bizarre happened when the rescuers were halfway out. The trapped individual seemed to have vanished. My attention was focused on the patrol boat, so I didn't see what happened. But according to the couple next to us, they just quote-unquote faded out of existence without moving a single muscle. Well, as you might imagine, we were speechless, but in the exact location of where that individual was standing, there was a small rock. But there's no way the lot of us would have mistaken that small rock for an individual, could we? When the rescuers arrived, they examined the area, walking right up to that rock. After 30 minutes or so, they began to head back empty-handed. Now, the park employees had been in contact with the rescuers during the process. Well, according to them, all of us had mistaken a rock for an individual. I felt insulted, but honestly wasn't surprised this was the outcome. The other onlookers and I remained on that beach for over an hour and discussed the strange sighting amongst ourselves. Still, we were all convinced that what we saw was a real person. The quote-unquote rock had a torso, arms, and legs. Kinda hard to mistake it for a simple little rock. What's done is done, but I'll never forget it. Thanks for sharing my story, Jeff. Story 2. Hello, Rusty. Well, some time ago you shared a story about a group of firefighters who saw what they could only describe as some strange being that appeared to be quote-unquote made of fire as it moved gracefully through the blackened and charred forest of Lassen. I believe them because I saw something similar in July of 2018 while evacuating my rural neighborhood outside of Redding, California. For those of you unfamiliar with the Carr Fire, and that's C-A-R-R, it was a large wildfire that scorched nearly 230,000 acres of woodland, causing $1.7 billion in damages. My house was one of 125 homes claimed by the fire in West Redding just during the summer months. I was one of the last people to evacuate my neighborhood, and as I stuffed my most prized possessions in the back of my truck, I took one last good look around, and I knew I would never see it again this way. Above me, the skies were a dark orange color, and smoke blanketed my surroundings. Every house sat in silence, empty of their former occupants. Every innocent tree danced in the hot winds of their impending doom. And yet, there was a sort of peace that fell upon me. But it was a feeling that this was supposed to happen, the natural order of things. I was almost hypnotized by the sight, and I'll never forget it. I left the area with tears running down my eyes, some from smoke, but most from pure emotion. It was around 2 p.m., but it looked like 9 p.m. Wasn't long before I began to see the carnage right along the side of the road as I headed out. Abandoned vehicles with their headlights still on and their car doors propped open. Trees cooking in the distance with the occasional emergency vehicle screaming past me from the other direction. I must have been one of the last evacuees to leave the area as the streets were now deserted. As I headed north, little pockets of fire came into view. The smoke was so thick now, but the raging wind kept it from settling. Embers slowly pinged off the hood of my truck, and ash covered the windshield like snow. At this point, a small tree had fell on the road, blocking 80% of it. I remember slowing down to avoid it, and as I moved around it, well, something caught my eye, just off to the left, and up on top of an embankment. The inferno had now swept through a grove of ponderosa pines, but there, in the middle of a clearing of these trees, is what caught my attention. There was a figure standing there, completely engulfed by fire. Immediately, I hit the brakes and was about to leave the safety of my truck to help the poor guy out. That was until it did something I didn't expect, nor will ever forget. It moved gracefully, as if performing some kind of dance. The legs barely moved, but its arms moved cursively, in an artistic manner, as the head swayed back and forth, as if underwater. This strange little display left me speechless. It wasn't behaving like something would if it were burning alive. Instead, it was like it was submitting to it. I still get chills when I think about it. Well, after about 10 to 15 seconds of this, the creature became one with the surrounding wildfire, and after that, I no longer saw it. But that eerie image of it dancing still lingered in my mind. Whatever it was just like those firefighters saw in that story you shared some time ago. So I thought I'd share my experience with the listeners as well. Long story short, I made it out all right, and it wouldn't be until 3 weeks later that I could return to my old neighborhood, or what was left of it. It was completely unrecognizable, as you might imagine. Very little survived that wildfire, and I would eventually move on. One chapter ended that day, and a new one began. I can't explain what I saw on that dark day, but there was something so hauntingly beautiful about it. The way it danced amid the chaos all around it, like the violin players who continued to play as the Titanic was sinking. That's the feeling I got from it. Thank you for sharing my experience. Story 3. The Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex in Montana comprises of several wilderness areas south of Glacier National Park. The Great Bar, Scapegoat, and the Bob Marshall Wilderness. The area in total covers more than 1.5 million acres of pristine wilderness and includes a wide variety of wildlife, such as wolves, wolverines, moose, mountain lion, grizzly bear, and more. This is all information I looked up after my interesting experience that I had while visiting the area just last summer. My family and I were camping on the eastern end of the Bob Marshall Wilderness and along the Flathead River. On the first night of our 3-day stay at the campsite, we saw a very distinct-looking wolf. We had seen it standing on the other side of the river, just staring at us. Well, it stood there for about 30 minutes or so, contemplating our presence or whatnot, before abruptly jetting out of sight into the nearby woods. Now, I say distinct looking because it had an M-shaped stripe over the eyes on the forehead. The wolf was a mix of color, tan gray and white. Now, I had seen lots of wolves out in the wilderness over the years, but this one looked a bit different. Judging from its size, I'd say it was a grown adult female. Well, after it left, we kinda just forgot about her. On our second day, we set out to explore some of the other areas of the park, spending hours driving around, occasionally getting out for small hikes and photo ops. At this point, I believe we were somewhere around the Great Bar Wilderness, and about an hour-and-a-half drive from our campsite at Bob Marshall, when my wife immediately told me to pull over. Her gaze was fixated on a group of trees about 50 feet away. "It's that weird wolf again," she said excitedly. I got out of the car, lowered my sunglasses, and sure enough, there was a wolf just standing there, watching us. I can't say it was the exact same wolf we saw on the previous day, but damn, it matched to a T. Everything from the distinct M-shaped stripe down to the shape and size and color. Now, it's possible there were a pack of wolves that shared the same genetic traits, but I was no expert. Interesting coincidence either way. Well, the wolf would end up leaving a moment later, and we continued on. Well, the next day, our last day at the campsite, We were packing up when one of the kids yelled, "Wolf," as he ran up and hid behind me, pointing to a nearby picnic table. I was shocked to see that same wolf standing there, right next to our campsite. I grabbed my son's hand and we backed up toward the car, as my wife and our other son was already inside, organizing the back seat. The M-shaped wolf, which was now standing about 30 feet away, didn't seem interested in anything other than us. Those cold, golden eyes peered deep into my very soul, as if trying to send a message telepathically, telling me to hit the road. And that was exactly what I was thinking after this third encounter with it. I think it knew what I was thinking because it would casually turn around and slowly walk out of view. You can imagine the chaos at the campsite as we scrambled to cram everything inside the car after that. We were on the road seconds later. Now, I truly believe that we had seen the same wolf on 3 separate occasions and at 3 separate locations. For those of you brushing this off as nothing more than just a coincidence, what's the odds of this happening 3 different times with 3 different wolves that just happen to look identical? I'll leave you to think about that. These didn't look anything like traditional Montana wolves that I'd seen before. The whole thing was both intriguing and spooky, too. And then we got to ask ourselves, why was this creature of the forest so obsessed with us? Most wolves might have been curious, sure, but they'd probably get bored and run off or get scared and do the same thing, let alone stand in one place for a long period of time. I guess maybe they were just being territorial, but there was no act of aggression, as one might expect in that situation. I don't know, the whole thing was weird. Thank you, Pierce. Story 4. If you've ever visited Maine, chances are you've probably seen one of many lighthouses dotted up and down the coastline. Well, a few summers ago, my partner and I did just that. We visited Pemmican, Doubling Point, Portland Head, and several other lighthouses. Then there was Squirrel Point Lighthouse. Cute name, but one hell of a little hike just to get out to it. This is one of the more remote lighthouses in Maine, and also one of the oldest. Built in 1898, Squirrel Point Lighthouse is located at the very end of Arrowsick, a peninsula that jets out following the Kennebec River and around 15 miles from a town called Bath. Well, once you arrive at the trailhead, it's a short 1.5-mile trek through the thick forest and can be a bit strenuous for inexperienced hikers. Well, we arrived at the trailhead around 1 p.m. and set out. Perfect weather and not a cloud in sight. The trail sliced through a grove of lush green forest and some really interesting geological features. There were some mosquitoes out there, but not as many as I expected, which was a nice surprise. About 10 to 15 minutes later, we arrive at Squirrel Point Lighthouse, and we weren't disappointed. It was a beautiful little lighthouse that offered million-dollar views of the Kennebec River, as well as the historic town of Phippsburg just on the other side of the river. Best of all, we had the whole place to ourselves, spared of any obnoxious tourists, which was pretty rare considering every other lighthouse we visited were overwhelmed by people. We took advantage of this and stayed for around 45 minutes or so, taking pictures and just enjoying a nice little picnic. On the horizon, we noticed a storm front moving in from the east, and it was closing in quickly. Well, we left as the winds began to arrive, and a couple minutes later, the distant rumble of thunder cleared the way for heavy rainfall that would soon follow. Lucky for us, the tree cover protected us from what would be an otherwise solid soaker on the way out. About halfway back, though, the cracking of branches sounded from the woods to our right, and it seemed to keep up with our hurried pace as the storm intensified. My partner and I both agreed that something must have been aware of our presence, as their movement only seemed to match ours. Well, at this point I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little spooked by this, even though we both carried bear spray. Well, my partner and I kept a watchful eye as we continued jogging through the storm. But whatever it was just seemed to be out of eyeshot, picking the perfect tree or rock to dart behind. Stealthy to the eyes, yes, but not to the ears, as we continued to hear the cracking of branches keeping up with us. Even over the storm, we could still hear it. And then we finally saw what was running along the side of us. It was shocking, even grotesque. A head popped out from behind a rock, and it had the face of a pug, but more droopy. Before you laugh, let me finish. It had spiked, reddish hair, or what looked like hair, jetting outward from its head like a crown. Also, it had the sort of sickly smile that stretched from one ear to the other. As you might imagine, our jog turned into a dead sprint. We weren't going to wait around to find out what it was about to do. My partner was a bit slower than I, so I stayed behind her, watching our six. The creature seemed to keep up as well, disappearing in and out of the tree line, gradually getting closer with each reappearance. My bear mace remained locked on that thing, but the feeling I had is that it wouldn't have made a difference at all, considering the size, strength, speed, and the sort of intellect it seemed to have. My God, the last half mile took forever, but we did it. We made it back to the safety of our car, completely soaked and matted with mud. But we didn't care. We just got away from that thing, whatever it was. The storm raged on for the remainder of the day. My partner and I took turns trying to explain what the hell it was that we saw, or what it might have been. But nothing really made any sense. So if you find yourselves hiking out to Squirrel Point Lighthouse in Maine, 1. Always check the weather. But 2. Bring protection and be aware of your surroundings. That was a sobering experience, to say the least. Thank you, Rhonda and Jill. And there you have it. I'll be working on a new compilation soon, but in the meantime, I'm also researching another case study that I'll be uploading before too long. So get out there and enjoy that summer weather. Stay cool, stay safe, and you'll hear from me soon.